The event of this visitation of Mary to Elizabeth was marked by the church as a feast day, which, to be clear, is not a big fancy meal, but a day of recognizing persons who are considered saints in the Catholic Church. This feast day was designated by the Franciscans in 1263 and then later affirmed by Pope Urban VI in 1389 as an attempt to reconcile the divisions after 13 years of the Western Schism in the Roman Catholic Church, also known as the one where more than one guy was deemed pope. From those medieval times on, the feast day recognizing Mary's visit to Elizabeth hung in the late spring or early summer time frame, which seemed a little confusing at first, but makes sense when we think about the timing of pregnancies. It is sometimes shocking to me how much I become accustomed to understanding a story in a particular way. And we have so often heard the entire series of events of the Christmas story compressed into the span of a week or two, or even just a few days. Honestly, just a few minutes is sufficient if we read it right out of the Gospel of Luke. Yet, as a person who has birthed 4 children, I suppose it should not seem odd to me that several months passed between Mary's awareness that she was pregnant and the birth of her child. As we read in Luke 1, the timing of angel's visit to Mary actually is introduced by indicating how far along Elizabeth was in her pregnancy, 6 months along, to be exact. And so for Mary to learn and accept this surprising news and then hurry to visit Elizabeth and stay there for about 3 months, Mary's visit must have ended right about the time of the birth of John the Baptist, and the whole scheme of the story expands. It is unlikely that the actual day of Jesus' birth was December 25th. It is unlikely that it was even in December. Using other clues to put a potential date on things like the shepherd's field activity and Zechariah's priestly duties in the temple, it's more likely that it was in September, or maybe March. It's hard to really say. I'm not sure we can take the date too seriously, and I'm not sure that's much the point anyway, since the goal of the Gospels was to tell a theological story and not a chronological one. But clearly there is time passing between the angel's visit to Mary and then Mary's visit to Elizabeth and then the birth of Jesus. And while the focus on the pregnancies is obviously a key part of the story, sometimes this story is told portraying Mary as a walking womb, as a passive player in a game that was not so much about her as about the infant she bore. Yes, she carries and births Jesus, but she is more than that. She is a breathing, living, speaking, singing participant, important in her own right. Elizabeth recognizes this and clearly names Mary's value as the mother, the woman, the person, the voice. Perhaps most significantly, Mary recognizes it herself in the act of singing these words, and in doing so, magnifies the upside-down nature of God's reign, echoing women before her, Miriam, Deborah, Hannah, Judith, all of whom were more than just merely present. They were not just bystanders, they were essential and active forces in bringing the nature of God into the world. So in addition to recognizing the value of Mary's role as more than just carrier of the Christ child, as more than just supporter of and supported by Elizabeth, which are critical pieces of this story, what Mary says or sings is huge and a little nonsensical, truth be told. Verses 46 to 55 that Rose so graciously read make up what is often called Mary's Magnificat, so named because the first line demonstrates Mary's desire to magnify or glorify God. There are kind of 2 phases of this song. First, Mary self-identifies as the highly favored one and continues to describe the blessings of the Mighty One looking with favor upon her, and she rejoices in God's mysterious act. And then it shifts into more prophetic language, often noted to be modeled after Hannah's song in 1 Samuel chapter 2. Mary's song, in the words of the message, indicate that God scattered the bluffing braggarts, knocked tyrants off their high horses, pulled victims out of the mud. The starving poor sat down to a banquet. The callous rich were left out in the cold. And ironically, the prophecy is in the past tense. It has happened. This message flies in the face of normal human social order. In reality, in the real world, the rich and strong and powerful get more, and the poor and starving have not enough. That's just the way it works. But here Mary says that all switches up, which is good news for everyone, right? Well, certainly if you are the hungry or the poor or the lowly or the oppressed or the outsider or the banned, there is reason for joy, for celebration. This is good news indeed. But it might not sound like such good news if you or we are the rich and the powerful, the proud and the top, the satisfied and the protected. And then it would be quite foolish to help make a way for that change, wouldn't it? I spent a lot of time this week thinking about the word foolish. Things that seem ridiculous, silly, nonsensical. Things that create an interruption in the normal rhythm and routine of life. Things that are sometimes offensive, scandalous, like the embodiment of the sacred in the physical. It's a mismatch. It brings the essence of the divine into a human body that, let's be frank, makes sounds and smells that sometimes aren't very divine. The fact that I'm spending 15 or so minutes up here even talking about this when we have gifts to buy and wrap and food to cook and events to attend and much bigger issues in our lives to deal with, why in the world are we prioritizing being here? We know this story. We've heard it for years. Nothing changes about it. It's written down, and it's been written. This is not new. In the words of Dietrich Bonhoeffer during Advent 1933, the Song of Mary is the oldest Advent hymn. It is at once the most passionate, the wildest, one might even say the most revolutionary Advent hymn ever sung. This is not the gentle, tender, dreamy Mary whom we sometimes see in paintings. This song has none of the sweet, nostalgic, or even playful tones of some of our Christmas carols. It is instead a hard, strong, inexorable song about the power of God and the powerlessness of humankind. End quote. The words of the Magnificat were banned in India during British rule, banned in Guatemala during the 1980s, banned in Argentina following the response to the dirty war by the mothers of La Plaza de Mayo after their children disappeared. These words were and still are viewed as too controversial, too dangerous, too revolutionary, foolish, ridiculous, absurd. But it's not just the message that's foolish, it's the messenger, or the messengers, really. Before we have this unexpected king arriving as an infant in a manger, we have the perhaps more unexpected and, let's be true, silly proposition that pretty much the whole point of Jesus' life is announced or sung in the joy of two pregnant women visiting each other. One who is way too old to even be pregnant, and one who is pregnant out of wedlock and with no intervention, shall we say, by a human man. Seems a little absurd. This would never be the expected means of conveying the expected important message into the world. Sort of like if a bunch of women were the first ones to announce and preach the message of the resurrection of Christ. Surely that would never happen. This message in the Magnificat was so foolish that it was read aloud at the Festival of Fools. Let me tell you a little about that event. The history is a little sketchy, but during the 1100s, so we're talking medieval times, a tradition emerged in Europe where celebrations would break out in city squares in foolishness. If you've seen the 1996 movie The Hunchback of Notre Dame, the part where they perform the song Topsy-Turvy highlights this event. Dancing, mask-wearing, jesters, and clowns would appear. The primary feature of this celebration was the act of turning authority on its head. An ordinary citizen would be crowned Archbishop of Fools, and kings would be considered peasants for a day. Clergy roles would be reversed. The higher-ups would become low, and the underlings would gain temporary power. The religious traditions were mocked, and the foolishness of human reality was raised up. Lay people, non-clergy, would act like priests, and they would put on clothes backwards, hold books upside down, use orange peel circles as glasses, blow ashes from their censers into each other's faces, speak gobbledygook in place of sacred liturgical chants and words. Animals would be brought into churches. Stinky aromas would be introduced to the senses, all with the goal of subverting the pretensions and hierarchy of both the church and society, turning everything on its head, masking the point that perhaps things are not or should not be what they seem. Foolish, ridiculous, absurd. I saw a foolish thing on a video news clip yesterday as I was scrolling through social media. A man, a father in Gaza, sobbing and shouting that he cannot take any more. He has no help, and he is at his wit's end. He has no food, no shelter, children to care for. And he collapsed in tears, head falling into the lap of his child, who I would guess was 9 or 10 years old. That's ridiculous, foolish, nonsensical. That's not the way things go. This child cannot support that father. And yet I imagine this father is not alone in his dismay. Other fathers and mothers in Israel and Ukraine and Russia and Nigeria and Haiti and Venezuela, heads collapsing into the laps of young children, desperate and in need and alone in a world that prioritizes power and violence at any cost. I saw photos yesterday from a friend who was in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, to be clear, where Christmas celebrations are going strong, lights and trees and food and horse-drawn sleigh rides through the street. Yet in the West Bank, the headlines read, "Christmas is canceled in Bethlehem." No lights, no decorations, no celebrations in that original Bethlehem, except for one. Can you show the slide? You may have seen this photo in the news. You can go to the second one. Thank you. This is what the front of the sanctuary looks like at the Evangelical Lutheran Christmas Church in Bethlehem, where the Reverend Munther Isaac and his congregation have opted to depict this version of the nativity scene, with the baby Jesus laying on the rubble, wrapped in a Palestinian garb, as a way to draw attention to the violence and killing in Gaza. How foolish, how ridiculous, how absurd. This is not the nativity scene. This is not how the story goes. In an interview, Reverend Isaac said, "We're happy that we were able to speak for our people and that this one picture spoke more than many, many words. I'm still baffled and struggling as to why this picture drew more attention than actual pictures of children in Gaza." Foolish, absurd, ridiculous. Perhaps it's time to lean into being a little foolish. It is this foolishness that draws attention and provides the opportunity to birth and create all things new. The foolishness of every single word of the candles that we have been lighting this Advent season. The foolishness of hope. The foolishness of peace. The foolishness of joy. And next week, perhaps the most foolish one of them all, love. So maybe we need to be a little foolish. Maybe we should be a lot foolish. And in doing so, may we draw attention to reveal the authentic nature of God without pretense, embodied and fleshy, in the ridiculous nature of the human experience. Counter to that which we often claim is ideal, and instead pointing the way to what can be, full of mystery, beauty, joy, and occasionally silliness. Awake to the possibility and potential of all things new that come from the unknown, unpredictable, nonsensical masking of reality. Topsy-turvy, inside out, sometimes absurd, and always foolish. The essence of Jesus, who will come, is present now and has always been, to pull the powerful down from their thrones and to lift up the lowly, to fill the hungry with good things and send the rich away empty-handed. Sung during this interaction with the most unusual of messengers, Mary and Elizabeth, who are, like us and with us and for us, part of the foolish story of God in the world, divine in human, sacred in profane, heaven on earth. May it be so.